In this first lesson for political ideas, what we're going to do is to take an introduction to the study of liberalism. Now, liberalism is where we're going to begin, essentially, with the subject of political ideas. It is arguably one of the most important, at the very least, it is one of the most influential of the political ideas and political ideologies that we're going to study over the next few months and potentially the whole year. And so what we're going to do is just introduce it in this lesson and outline the scope of the next series of lessons when we look at the concept of liberalism. This is an introduction to the political philosophy of liberalism. The origins of liberalism is something that we're going to study in the next lesson, talk about where it came from, essentially, looking at individuals such as John Locke, talk about individuals that wrote in relation to various events which take place, so various different revolutions that take place in France and in America and in England, for example, and the influence that they had over the development of ideas of liberalism, and also vice versa, the influence that liberalism had over those ideas. So the first question, what is liberalism? And really, I mentioned earlier on, and I would say again, that it is argued by many political commentators and many different political philosophers that liberalism is probably the most important area of political philosophy to this day. Now, suggesting that it is the most important political ideology to this day. Of course, if you are somebody who ascribes to one of the other political ideologies that we're going to describe, so for example socialism or communism or anarchism, you would probably come to a different conclusion. But at the very, very least, even if you do not ascribe to something of a liberal mindset, if you are a conservative or a socialist, for example, you can at least understand the importance of the influence of liberalism over both domestic and global political institutions. So the question is, why is this the case? Why is it so important? Well, one of the reasons for its importance is because of its long and very complex history and very long and complicated historical development. It may also be due to the influential ideas that are provided. According to the United Nations, for example, as many as 66%, a whole 2/3 of all states in the world today may be able to be classed as liberal democracies. Now, the extent to which some democracies are more liberal than others is, of course, a debate for another day. And, of course, that phrase, liberal democracies, if it is going to include 2/3 of all states, is a quite broad umbrella phrase. So, for example, the level of democratic participation and liberalism that exists in some European states would differ to that exists in the United States, for example. However, they would still be classed under this term as liberal democracies. And it is therefore undoubtedly the case that liberalism can be seen as the most prevailing ideological position that exists in the world to this day. Some will disagree, others will disagree on the basis that there is not a clearly shared understanding of what liberalism entails, and this is definitely true. We're going to get to the different variations of liberalism in future lessons' time, but ultimately, if we were to describe liberalism under this umbrella phrase, and we were going to take all of the different ideologies that exist within liberalism, we could probably come to the conclusion that it is the most prevailing ideological position that exists. Now, there are difficult questions that we're going to need to ask and answer in this series on liberalism. So, for example, what are the political positions of liberals and liberalism? What do we mean when we talk about going from the philosophy, going from the ideology, to the policy, the actual real-world application of ideas? What do liberal societies and liberal states actually embody? What does it actually mean to be a liberal, for example? Ultimately, it is potentially seen as by many as a quite confusing political ideology because, as mentioned before, it has a very long and complicated historical development, and we will see and trace this historical development in the next few lessons from the Enlightenment period to the modern day. Now, there are also differences in terms of agreement in relation to what actually constitutes elements of liberalism and what does not. All of these things are going to be discussed in more detail as time goes on. And this does bring us to the scope of this series. We're going to talk about the origins of liberalism next. We're then going to talk about some of the core ideas of liberalism, talk about how liberalism approaches conceptions of human nature, conceptions of the state, conceptions of society, and conceptions of the economy. We're going to talk about classical liberalism. We're going to talk about the origins, essentially, those like the thinkers and writings of John Locke and Mary Wollstonecraft, and sort of moving into the sort of classical / modern conceptualizations under the works of people like John Stuart Mill. We'll then talk about modern liberalism, so individuals such as John Rawls and Rawlsian theories of justice, how these apply to the modern conceptions of liberalism. And then we're going to finish by talking about a quite controversial element of liberalism, or at least controversial in the sense of does it actually classify as part of this broader catalogue of liberal ideas, this idea of neoliberalism? Or is neoliberalism more of a conservative ideology, something that we're going to get to when we start to then move on to looking at conservatism in more detail?